Hey folks, welcome to ADSR. I'm Stephen Ellestad. Make sure you subscribe to ADSR YouTube channel and follow on social media. So over these past couple tutorials I've been talking about mixing workflows and coming up with some basic ways of working that suit your style and abilities. And in this tutorial I wanted to get a little more specific and talk about the way that I might approach a particular track and hopefully give you some ideas for approaching your next mix as well. Getting started here, we really want to start by getting organized. And that means if you have mixed templates or specific routing you like to use, specific metering or channel strip settings, let's go ahead and get them in the session. And then I'd also like to come in and clean up the session. That means I'm making a copy of the session and going through and getting rid of, say, extra takes or junk tracks that didn't make it to the final arrangement. And I'm also looking for any major errors or problems. If there's any pops or clicks, I'll get rid of those. I'll trim out dead air, say on a vocal take. And I'll also address issues of maybe tempo or timing or tuning as needed, because we don't want to compound those issues later by doing different mixing things that might make them more prominent. And then before I even touch a fader, I'm going to do a first listen. And this is just in the DAW. I'm not printing a copy of it. And I'm just taking notes as I go. I might even listen a couple of times listening for specific things. But first I'm listening for the problem areas that I really hear need some attention, whether it's in the low end or the spatial imaging or the sharpness or the cut of a particular part. And I'm also making note of ideas or opportunities I can use to get creative with the mix later on. I'm not necessarily going to tackle those right away, but I want to have a list of ideas that I can do when it becomes time to handle them. The first thing we want to think about is building a good foundation from which we can base our more creative decisions on. And that means balancing out our levels and getting a good foundation going. A lot of this is about watching your gain and getting things organized into groups. So for example, in this session here, I've got things organized into a couple of groups. I've got a basic drums group, then I've also got a noise percussion group. Then I've got some pad layers, some arpeggiator layers, and a bass group, as well as a couple other things, including a bunch of different mix effects that are in a group. The reason I want them in groups is that if I can adjust or balance things at the group level, there's no need to deal with the individual tracks. While quite often I will go to individual tracks and adjust and tweak them, I can set my basic levels at the group level and feel pretty confident that my mix is going to have a solid foundation. So looking at this drum group, for example, maybe go through and first I want to just balance the groups against each other, but then now I can go through and listen for the balancing between the kick, snare, and hat. And adjust that as I need. And then perhaps I'll come and solo my noise percussion and look at the levels inside of there and balance those as needed. Now I'm not actually doing a full mix in this tutorial, I just want to kind of demo some of the concepts. But basically we're balancing at our groups and we're looking at how all of our groups are coming, and I'm keeping an eye on my stereo output because all of my group level faders and signals are feeding into that currently. And once I've got a good foundation that I'm happy with as a starting point, just for basic levels, then I'm going to do another listening session. At this point I might print a pass of it, and again I'm going to listen for my problem areas and make notes to correct them, and then I'll come back and immediately fix them. I'll also make notes for creative opportunities. At this point we've got some basic gain staging and some group organization. The next stage I like to do at this point is carve out some space. I want to look for the most important parts of the song. Usually it's the kick or the vocals or the melody line. And then I want to kind of figure out a priority list. What are the most important things? Because not everything is created equal in a song. I'm going to come through and use filters to clean up all the junk frequencies. Now we have less of that with virtual instruments than we do with real instruments. For example, on an acoustic drum kit, there's going to be a whole lot of low frequency noise on the hi-hat or even the overheads that we could probably just filter out because we have individually in my kick drum or toms, for example. But regardless, I'm going to try to get rid of all the excess space. And the rule of thumb, basically, I'm applying high pass or low pass filters as needed, and then I'm going to just sweep it up or down until I hear a change in the timbre of the sound, and then I'll back it off because we're not trying to change the sound necessarily. We're just trying to get rid of all the extra frequencies that are building up. So for example, I can come in here on my hi-hat and solo that out. And we'll just apply a basic filter. and I found a point where it's no longer really changing, so I'm just confident there's nothing else there. I just don't want to have excess mud building up in the low end of my track in particular. Again, this applies less to a situation with virtual instruments than it does with real instruments, but it's still not a bad idea. Things that are in groups, we generally want to address the individual parts if they have elements that cover the whole frequency spectrum, but if it's just a bunch of high frequency stuff, maybe we could filter out the low end on the group and save ourselves some work. And so we'll go through and do a bunch of basic filtering and cleanup, especially on things like vocals. If we haven't chopped out dead air on the vocal mic, there's going to be a lot of low frequency information that tends to build up that's not really not part of the vocal track itself, and so we want to adjust that or remove that as needed. And so the next thing we want to look at is probably creating some space and adding some depth. I want to look at panning individual elements to create a balanced stereo field, but then I also want to look at adjusting the width of stereo tracks and the groups for variety. We want to make sure that if we have something on the far left, there's something else of a similar timbre or nature or role that's kind of balancing on the other side. Now that's not a hard and fast rule, but generally speaking we want to get things balanced across the stereo field. Just playing with the width of stereo tracks and groups can also add a lot of subtlety and variety in there. And some DAWs will let you specifically control the width of a stereo track. Other ones are going to require a specific plugin. But for example, in Logic, we can use the stereo spread and adjust a particular width of something or what have you. There's lots of tools available to us for those kinds of things. At this point, maybe I'll also use tricks like, say, Haas effect to widen things that are in mono, or I'll use mid-side processing to adjust certain groups, especially high-frequency groups. Next, we're going to come in and look at adding some depth with time effects, and so placing elements front to back with different levels and types of reverbs. Remember that we can adjust both the send level and the overall return level. So if we look at this noise group, for example, we'll solo it out. I'll also solo out my mix effects. We can get a lot of, especially with delays, a lot of creative things. You'll notice that I have both a straight delay and a dotted delay. The straight delay is in 1/8 notes and the dotted delay is in 16th notes. But the basic rule of thumb is we can use delays that are in time to create depth without a loss of maybe clarity, such as a reverb would give us. But we could add texture and depth with, say, a syncopated delay, a dotted or a triplet delay. But once we've gone through and done some basic positioning front to back with delays and reverbs, then it's definitely time at this point to print a copy of the mix and probably go to a different space and listen critically. When I'm doing this, I'm evaluating my progress and I'm making a note of issues that I hear, especially with panning and depth. But if I hear things in the foundation or the balancing, I'll adjust that as well. This whole thing is definitely a back and forth process. Now, once I've got a decent panning and a depth of field going that I'm happy with, I'm going to shift my focus probably to looking at power and punch and energy. And I'll generally look at groups first and then individual parts as needed. Now we're generally going to look at using dynamics processors, compressors, gates, expanders, limiters to bring out different levels of punch. But one caution here, over-compression can really kill your track. I like to approach tracks with, say, multiple compressors or dynamics processors with maybe different thresholds and attack or release settings to shape different aspects of the signal without necessarily just squishing everything down and removing all the dynamic range. In this stage, we're probably looking at adding some parallel processing into our groups as well, whether it's particularly parallel compression or maybe even parallel saturation. We're going to use that to bring out additional energy and blend it in as needed, just to make sure that we're getting certain elements cutting through with energy and power. I'll also look at kind of the order of importance of groups. What are the most important groups? And then I'll look at sidechaining them or notching them by order of importance so that, say, my vocal or my drum group is always, front and center, at least especially my kick, but I'll maybe notch out sections of my synths or background vocals or something like that. Come through again. At this point, we should have a basic, well-crafted mix. There should be some separation and clarity and some dynamic range. And at this point, I'll definitely print the mix, but I'll often take a day or so to come back to the listening session because I want to let my ears kind of refresh a little bit, get some separation between the session and the decision making. I'll make a very specific list of adjustments, but I should be fairly happy with most things. It's usually little tweaks, but I'll make those adjustments. And at this point, I should have a very solid static mix that's basically ready for automation and the final mixing. Once we've got this basic static final mix, now it's time to think about adding movement. This isn't necessarily the automation that we've done in the arrangement or composition process. Those were things that we did for specific creative purposes generally. At this point, I'm thinking about basic automation of things like elements panning, maybe sends to reverbs moving to bring things forward or back in different sections. And then I'm going to look specifically at things like section and group automation. That is, maybe the bass or the drums or the noise percussion builds up in intensity, slowly climbing as it goes to the hook. I'll also look at applying automation specifically to my effects and transition points. Changes in sections of a song are really key opportunities for adding automation. Whether it's things like automating the stereo field or the stereo width to bring things in real tight, or to open things up at a big chorus, looking at bringing in additional reverbs or delays for, say, a throw effect type of thing. All these things are really effective at transition points because the listener is very much focused on what's happening and the changes in the song. So that's just a basic walkthrough of how I might approach a mix. I'm sorry I didn't have time to actually do the mix, but I will be looking at some of that in some upcoming courses on ADSR. I hope you got something useful out of this and find some new ways to maybe approach the mix process for your own tracks. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them on the YouTube page. And once again, make sure you subscribe to the ADSR YouTube channel and follow on social media. I'm Stephen Ellestad for ADSR. Thanks a lot and have a great day.